Jeff. Good to see you. How you been, man? It's good to see you. I appreciate you. Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.
I put some notes up here in my glasses,
man.
or I won't be able to see. I'm getting old as I can be. I just want to.
Gosh, we have to do it, don't we?
We do.
Put the notes up there. Thank you so much. You
Thank
didn't have to do
you.
that.
I know,
told
I know,
Kathleen,
but
I said, look, y'all.
I wanted to
happy
make
do
sure
this.
that. There we go. And my water.
Already
Stick that water
there,
down there.
It's
Now
gonna
go
be
back
great.
and talk to people.
That's a great picture of your dad.
Yeah, it is.
That's awesome. I love it. Yeah,
I love it.
Really cool.
On behalf of Dr. In Young Lee, the First United Methodist Church family, the Yelton family, I thank you for your presence here today and welcome you to this time of remembrance and celebration and worship of our Lord. Thank you to our musicians today, Stephen and Charlie, so much. Hear these words. Dying, Christ destroyed our death. Rising, Christ restored our life. Christ will come again in glory. As in baptism, Ernest, Doc, put on Christ, so in Christ may Doc be clothed with glory. Here and now, dear friends, we are God's children. What we shall be has not yet been revealed, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Those who have this hope purify themselves as Christ is pure. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and I am life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end and the last. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I hold the keys of hell and death. Because I live, you shall live also. My friends, we're gathered here to praise God, to witness to our faith as we celebrate the life of Ernest Hugh Yelton. We come together in grief, acknowledging our human loss, but we come also together in gratefulness and appreciation and celebration. May God grant us grace that in pain we may find comfort, in sorrow, hope, and more importantly, in death, resurrection. Charlie. Thank you, Charlie. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Dear God, who gave us birth, you are ever more ready to hear than we are to pray. You know our needs before we ask and our ignorance in asking. Give to us now your grace that as we shrink before the mystery of death, we may see the light of eternity. Eternal God, we praise you for the great company of all those who have finished their course in faith and now rest from their labor. We praise you for those many who are dear to us, whom we name in our hearts before you. Today, we especially praise you for Doc, whom you have graciously received into your presence. To all of these, grant your peace. Let light perpetual shine upon them, and help us so to believe, for we have not seen, that your presence may lead us through our years and bring us at last with them into the joy of your home, not made with hands, but eternal in the heavens, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I invite you to share in the reading of Psalm 23, and that can be found in the red hymnal, page 754, if you will read the print in bold. I invite you to stand as you are able. Please stand. (754) Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Leads me beside still waters, restores my life, leads me in paths for the sake of the Lord's name. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. The word of the Lord. Our gospel reading today comes from Matthew chapter 25. The king said to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Joe.
Thank you, Tanya and Charlie and Stephen. I appreciate that. Tanya and Charlie were a part of our lives growing up and knew my parents very, very well, so it's apropos that they would both be here, especially Tanya. When I walk into this church, it's like a warm blanket is wrapped around me. And I said I wouldn't cry. Hold on. There is so much of our family that's associated with this church. Kathleen, Patty, and I were baptized right here. We came down that aisle and we were married right here. On the second aisle over here, the Yelton family sat right there for probably 25 years. Eventually having to move back as we moved on to college, and my parents wanted to make sure that the younger people with kids was able to come up here. We had MYF downstairs, the fellowship hall, countless times we were in the fellowship hall downstairs. And my mother and my sister, their ashes are out in the courtyard, and today, at the end of this service, my father will be out there. So there's a lot to this church, but I love the feeling that I get here. I was thinking about it last night, and I thought about Kim every time she gets the the clothes out of the dryer. If I'm sitting on the couch, she comes and dumps them on top of them because they're all warm. And that's the feeling that I get out of this. So, good morning. Thank y'all for being here. My father would have loved this. Today is not a day for tears, as I shed a few of them up here. My father would not have wanted that. He lived a great life, and he did everything that he wanted to do. And at the end, he said that he was ready to go. So today, we're going to celebrate his life, and we're going to rejoice, and we're going to be able to rejoice for the fact that we had him as long as we had him. If you had a relationship with him, whether it be a patient or whether you were a family or whether you were a friend, I want you to think about the times that you had with him. And my sole objective is that you know him better when you walk out this door than you walked into this door. So I'm going to tell you an amazing story about his life, and I'm going to tell you 5 things that I learned from it. And I'm going to start at the end because I think that's the most important piece for everybody to listen to. I've got a lot to say. He lived 102 years, 8 months, and 11 days. I got a lot of things to tell you about. But the first one I think is the most important, and this came basically at the end of his life. First, I want to tell you that he was healthy until probably the last 3 weeks of his life, which is amazing for somebody that is that age. And he had dementia, and I've talked to a lot of my friends in here about the dementia, and I'm sure Kathleen talked to a lot of people and had to deal with the dementia that he had, but he was happy. He was joyously happy. I know if you have parents or if you've had to deal with dementia or Alzheimer's, that can't always be the case, but he definitely was very, very happy, and he lived joyously all the way to the very last day. You know, I felt sorry for for Kathleen and the caregivers, because if you ever had to deal with somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia, what you have to deal with is saying the same thing over and over and over again. And Kathleen and the caregivers did it with so much love and grace. They ended up having to write the answers to many of the questions that he would have on a whiteboard. And so they would just point up there to the whiteboard so that he would see the answer. The interesting thing was he would read it and he was happy with it, and then he would go on and move on. Throughout his last few years, he wanted to sit out on the back porch. And if you look at the back of your program, that is a painting of the back porch that Kim did for us. And he would sit out there and he would look up at the sky, he would look up at the Carolina blue sky and just tell you, he was just amazed at how much God's grace was on him. He would talk about the trees, he would talk about the birds. And if you ever visited him, he would grab you by the hand and he would take you out to that patio and he would sit you down and he would make you look at everything. And I know many of you sat with him patiently, and I want you to know how much we really appreciate that, because he would just go on and on and on. And as he got later in life, he couldn't speak very clearly because his hearing was gone. So you'd have to listen very closely to whatever he had to say, but it was interesting because it was usually, it was amazing things that he would talk about. So whenever he lay down at night, he would go into almost a little bit of a trance. And it was kind of weird because his eyes were open, but we thought he was asleep. That's why I call it a trance. But he would talk about God and preach about God for hours on end as he lay there in the bed. It drove my mother crazy before she died because she couldn't sleep. And I'm sure it drove the caregivers and Kathleen crazy when you had to listen to him all the time, but he continuously talked about God. And as he got later in his life, he talked to God. And I don't mean like he was talking. I mean, it was like God was sitting right there beside him. And he was talking to him specifically. And they were deep, long conversations. And then when you got closer to about the last 2 to 3 weeks of his life, he started talking to other people that were in the room with him, that I'm certain were his family and his friends and his wife and Emily that had gone on before him. It was an amazing thing to sit and listen to. And I apologize, guys. I swore I wasn't going to do this. Yep. I was good today until I saw all of you. And I thought of all the memories that I've had with each one of you in here. And then I started getting upset. So I apologize. Anyway. Lord. So there's those 5 things that I wanted to tell you about that I learned from him. And this is the very first one I wanted to tell you. And I really need you to listen to this, because this is the most important thing that I'm going to tell you today. After this, you can zone out if you want to, if I talk too long, but I want you to listen to this one right here. You do not leave this world alone. Your friends and your family and God are there with you. I'm not asking you to have faith in that. I'm telling you that I saw it. My sister saw it. The caregivers saw it. Kim saw it. It was with my sister, it was with my mother, and it was with my father. He was so joyous because he knew that the minute he closed his eyes and he died, that all those people that he had been talking to were waiting for him to go to heaven. And there is a comfort in that. And I hope you find the comfort in that too. And what I would take from that is that live joyously to the very end, because there's nothing to worry about. I hear so many people that get worried about what's going to happen after they die. And I see this. I see what Mom and Daddy went through. I see what Patty went through. And I can tell you that there is nothing to worry about. Now you can zone out. That's the one thing I want you to take from here. All right. Sit back and relax. I'm going to tell you a story about my father's life, and it was an amazing life. He was born about 10 miles up the road from here off of Highway 64 going to Morganton, near a place called Centennial Church. If you've never been out to Centennial Church, you've got to go out there. It is a white clapboard church, probably holds no more than 75 people. It is one of the most peaceful places on earth that I've ever been to. I hope that you go out there sometime if you're from Rutherford and go take a look at it. And in that cemetery there is almost all Yeltons. It's where most of our family resides out there. My father and his 4 brothers and sisters, he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. He was the oldest. They lived on a farm out there, and that's where he grew up. And I would tell you that he told me that he was dirt poor growing up. Most of y'all know that I interviewed him before he died, and I interviewed my mother before he dies, and I have hours and hours worth of video of talking to them about their lives. So I'm using his words. But he also said that when he grew up that he never wanted for anything. He had plenty of food, and he had the clothes on his back and the love of his family that was there. And I loved hearing the stories about what he did out there in the middle of the country as he was growing up. They eventually moved into town, and right back behind this church is a street called Cleghorn Street. and that's where they ended up living. His father ended up opening a car repair shop. Shoof ended up taking it over. Charlie ended up taking it over, major part of our family down there. And he ended up growing up here inside of Rutherford. He didn't really have any great role models in his life to lead him down the path that he eventually took. And I don't want you to take anything negative from that, because his mother and father just grew up in a different time. They grew up in a tough time period. They didn't go to college. And so there wasn't something there to create this vision for him to be able to lead his life and turn his life into what it actually was. He told me that he was good in school, but he never really took it seriously until he met a man named Mr. Dennison. And Mr. Dennison took a great deal of time and effort to work with my father to give him that vision of life, of what his life could be in the future. And he made sure that he had the skills to finish school. And he gave him this idea that he could go down to Chapel Hill and attend college and become a doctor. And so he held my father accountable to all of the things that my father needed to be held accountable to. Many of you might not know this. My father had an IQ of close to 150. He was accepted into college at 15 years old, and he told me that he was scared to death when his mother put him on that bus to go to Chapel Hill. Think of it. I'm 15 years old. I've never been out of Rutherford County, and I'm leaving to go somewhere that I know nothing about. And he had just a few dollars in his pocket. He was scared to death when he went down there. Luckily, when he arrived, the mentor that Mr. Dennison had gotten for him down at Chapel Hill was waiting for him when he got off of that bus, and he got him into his dorm room. The guy told him, he said, I need you to come to my house the next day because I need you to do chores. And so he went to this man's house, and he got into the backyard, and there was a pile of wood on one side of his yard, and the man asked him to move it from one side of the yard to the other side of the yard. And he paid him money enough for him to be able to eat and get through that day. And he came back the next day, and he had Daddy move it from the left side back to the right side. And he did that for almost 2.5 weeks. But what I loved about that, which was just a great thing that I loved about that, is that it was not charity that he was being given. Mr. Dennison knew and wanted to teach my father to say, the stuff that you get in life, you have to work for. And so he made him move that wood back and forth. Eventually he got in, and he was eating at the school, and he didn't have to work with that mentor anymore. I asked my father on the video if he remembered the guy's name, and he couldn't remember his name. And I wish I knew that, because I would love to get in touch with his family to be able to talk to him about how much that meant to my father. One, that he was there at Chapel Hill waiting for him when he got there and shepherded him through the things that he needed to do. And number two is that he gave him something to do so that he would be able to eat. Daddy found out a few years ago that Mr. Dennison had actually paid for his first year of tuition. And actually paid the mentor in Chapel Hill the dollars that that mentor paid my father. And Mr. Dennison never told my father that, ever, until the day that he died. And actually, my father didn't find out about it until after Mr. Dennison died. He graduated from UNC in 3 years. He finished 2 years of medical school at UNC, and he finished his final 2 years of medical school at Duke. This was when UNC only had a 2-year medical school, so that's the reason he had to go over to Duke. And if you know my father, I think that would have probably just about killed him when he had to walk on that campus. So the second lesson that I learned from my father is that mentors matter, and that you have to take interest in other people, and you have to help them up on the ladder regardless of where you are on their ladder. There's always somebody that you can help to move up. I'm sure Mr. Dennison never understood that the generational impact that the things he did for my father, the impact that it would have on my father and my life also. We grew up watching my father give back to the community, and I know many of you in here did too. on a daily basis, whether it was free medical care, multiple international adopted children. I don't think many of you knew that, but he had children all over the world that he supported financially. He paid for different people's college education, and he supported the libraries here in Rutherford and also at Chapel Hill. He paid forward 100 times, just like Mr. Dennison paid forward in his life. After medical school, he ended up going to New York City to do his residency at Cornell Hospital in downtown Manhattan. And while he was in surgery, a young nurse came in. She was 19 years old. She was carrying a bottle of blood. This was back when the blood was not in plastic pints like they are today. It was in glass. And that nurse dropped that blood on the floor, and it broke. And that was my mother, and that's where they met. And they dated through the rest of his residency up there. I don't think a lot of you know this, but my father was a surgeon. I don't think anybody knows that. My father went to college and became a surgeon, and he came out and he started surgery, and then decided that he didn't like surgery, that he felt like it kept him away from people, and that he wanted to be closer to his patients, and then he went back and became a general practitioner here. I think people only think of him as a general practitioner here in Rutherford County. After residency, World War II was starting at that time, and as you know, everybody had to go to World War II. My father joined the Navy. He was a lieutenant in the Navy. This is a picture of him in the Navy down here on the left. My mother ended up going into the Army, and so while they dated, they ended up having to go apart because they went and did their basic trainings at different places. But fate would have it that they would end up coming back together on the island of Tinian in the South Pacific. Tinian is where the Enola Gay took off from. If you don't know what the Enola Gay is, the Enola Gay was the plane that carried the nuclear bombs that ended up being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombs' names were Fat Boy and Little Boy, and they took off from that island. And the reason they had to go out there is because they sent the medical unit, both from the Navy and from the Army, to go out there to build a field hospital, because the intent was that after they dropped the bombs, then there would be an invasion into Japan, and that they would have all kind of casualties from that invasion. And those casualties would come back to Tinian, and so there needed to be a hospital set up there to take care of those. But as you know, the war ended right after that, and so the hospital was not needed. And for about 6 months, my mother and father lived on this South Pacific island. My father was on one end where the ships were. My mother was on the other end up where the hospital was. And my father would take a sailboat, and he would sail up to that end of the island. And they would hang out on the beach all day, and they would go to the officers' club and drink. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you... They had a good time. My parents did not miss a drink. I just want you to know that. But they had a great time, and my father ended up having to leave earlier than my mother. My father was sent back to the U.S., and my mother ended up having to go into Japan with a medical unit to go in with the troops that went in after that, and she was there about another 6 months before she came back. When she came back, my mother went to New York City to work, and my father went to Bryn Mawr Hospital, which is near Villanova in Pennsylvania. And while he was there, this was when the World War II was coming to an end, and the Allies got together and said, we cannot leave Europe the way Europe is right now. If we do, that worse things could happen, that it had been so destroyed. And so under the Marshall Plan, they decided to go back and rebuild Europe. And they asked my father if he would go and run a field hospital, set up a field hospital in Athens, Greece, to take care of the construction workers and the military that were over there as they went through rebuilding Europe. And while he was getting ready to go, he decided that he would call up and ask my mother if she would be the staff nurse in the hospital to help run it. And she agreed, and they took off over to Greece. You know, I think Greece was one of the greatest times of my parents' lives. They talked about it all the time. I remember sitting in the living room at our house talking to my mother a few months before she passed away, and this was one of the things she kept going back to, is about the time that she had in Greece and how much fun that they had there. And I would tell you, I think that that is what set them up for traveling. You know, they spent about 2 years there, and I think that it gave them this sense of adventure after being in the South Pacific and being in Greece. And they ended up traveling for the rest of their lives, usually by themselves, but a lot of times they would take the three of us and we would go all over the world. My father would close his practice 4 to 6 weeks a summer. Some of you that have been around long enough, there was another general practitioner here named Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell and my father had an agreement between the two of them that if one of them wanted to go on vacation, the other one would take care of all the other's patients. And so he would shut down his practice for 4 to 6 weeks and go out and travel around the world, and those patients would go to Dr. Mitchell, and then Dr. Mitchell would do the same thing. Travel was about education for my father. Education was the most important things to him. It was about seeing his international adopted children. It was about adventure, and it was about gathering pollen from rhododendrons, which I will tell you a little bit more about. So the third lesson I learned from my father was to go see the world and interact with everybody that you could. He had a saying. He said, "When in Rome, do as the Romans." And what he meant by that is don't just go to the tourist place. Get out and be with the people and see the people. And he felt like if you could go and be with the people and understand how they viewed the world and the lives that they grew up in, that you would have a better understanding of the world, and it would end racism or classism. My God, we need that today. I'm going to read you a quote from Mark Twain that I think is just absolutely perfect for the way my father viewed life and travel. It says, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in the little corner of earth all one's life." I believe that with all of my heart. I absolutely believe that with all of my heart. And I have tried to live my life by that. When my father came back to Rutherfordton, after being on the Marshall Plan, they were up there about 2 years. Money was still tight. And so he decided to physically build his office on West Court Street. And most of you know where that is if you're from Rutherfordton. He and his brothers, Wayne and Charlie, ended up, Shoof, we called him Shoof, I'm sorry, Charlie, because that's how I know him, ended up building that office. And at the top, they built a apartment up there. And I mean, it is a tiny apartment. It had one bathroom and one room. And in that room, he had his bed and a living area and a small kitchenette. And that's where he lived as he started his practice. He finally asked my mother to marry him, and she accepted. And they got married in New York, and he drove up there with Shoof and Naomi. Shoof is Charlie Yelton's father and mother. And so I interviewed Naomi also to hear things about my father, and I wanted to get her story too. And she was telling me about when they were going up to New York. And on the way up there, they had a wreck in the car. And they tore the car up pretty bad, but it was still drivable. But when they got up there, and if you see the wedding pictures of my father, he has cuts and bruises and black eyes and bandages and everything all over his face. And here are people that have grown up in Rutherford County. My mother grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, across from Central Park. And here she was marrying somebody from Rutherfordton, North Carolina. So there was a bit of a cultural change there as they went through that. But Naomi was telling me how much fun they had up there and how gracious everybody was up there to them, having come from down here in the South, and they loved it. At the end, Shoof and Naomi got on the train and rode the train back to Rutherford, and my parents took Shoof's car and went to Virginia Beach for their honeymoon. And while they were going, they got pulled over. Daddy was speeding. And the policeman came up and he looked at the car, and the bumper was tied with rope on it. It was all beat up, and he came up to the side of the car, and my father was just beat up and bloody and black and blue and everything. And my mother, sitting in the passenger seat, she said she talked to the policeman. She said, hey, we just got married. We're going on our honeymoon. And she told me that the policeman looked at my father, looked at the car, looked back at her, shook his head, and he goes, God bless you, ma'am. Good luck. And let him go and did not give him a ticket. When they got home, they started their practice, him as the doctor and my mother as his nurse. And I know most of you were with my here at my mother's funeral and heard me talk about the regulars. And many of the children of the regulars are in here today. But once my father asked my mother to marry him, she came down here to visit him. He picked her up at night in Charlotte. She drove up here and stayed at a boarding house right next to my father's office. And she got up the next morning, came up and walked down Main Street, and the streets were dirt. And she went back and picked up the phone and called her mother, and she says, there is no way I'm leaving Manhattan and I'm coming to Rutherford and marrying him. But luckily, one of the regulars, Edna 20, came and picked her up and took her up to Lake Lure. They went on a picnic, and they went over to Ed and John 20's house that night. And the regulars, that 7 couples, ended up going over there, and they had a fantastic time. And she goes, you know what, I think I can do this. And she ended up staying here and marrying him and moving down here. You know, over the next years, Daddy focused on building his practice and giving back to the community. He was heavily involved in countless organizations, but his passions were horticulture and his patience. Those were the 2 things that he focused on. And from a horticulture point of view, it was rhododendrons mainly, camellias, and wildflowers. Many of you might not know this, but he had 2 heart attacks by the time he was 50. And I think that this was mainly caused by his work. He would get up in the morning. He would go and do rounds at the hospital. He would leave there. He would make it to his office about 8:30 or 9. He would stay there and work until about 6 o'clock. He would go back to the hospital and do his rounds. And he would come back home sometimes 8 and 9 o'clock. And I know Kathleen and I, especially me as a young boy, were starving by the time he got home. But one of the things I love that my parents required us to do was we always ate together. It didn't matter what time he came home. We sat down together, and all 5 of us ate there in the kitchen. So I want to tell you 2 quick stories about him going on his house calls. I don't know if I just said that, but he would come home, and after we would eat, he would then go on house calls. And I would say 40% of the time, you correct me if I'm wrong, 40% of the time he would get up in the middle of the night and go on a house call. Doctors don't do that today. And he would be gone until all hours of the morning, and he would come back and he would restart that cycle again. I want to tell you 2 stories about him going on 2 house calls. The first one was my mother was